So this is going to be the start of a new series that I'm going to be working on, which is essentially going to be an introduction to metaphysics. I think it's really important that I get this out there because so many of my videos and the things I talk about on a regular basis presuppose how I conceive of reality on a metaphysical level. And I consider Christianity to be thoroughly grounded primarily in metaphysics. As I'm sure a lot of you can guess, I'm going to be approaching it from a Thomistic standpoint, so it's going to be more or less stemming from the metaphysical thought of St. Thomas Aquinas and medieval scholasticism in general. Now, throughout this series, I'll be using one main primary book as my guide, and I highly recommend it to all of you. It's by a Thomist that I've learned a lot from and respect very highly, and it's titled The One and the Many, A Contemporary Thomistic Metaphysics, by the late priest Father Norris Clark. One of the reasons that I love Clark is that he's really able to take the richness of St. Thomas and all his scholastic glory and communicate his ideas in such an accessible and approachable way without really at all compromising the substantial richness of the ideas, which is really hard to do when so much of the richness is grounded in the terminology itself, which is often difficult to translate to people. So, to begin the series, I think it's important to start off with the most obvious question, as Father Clark does in his book. What is metaphysics? It's a question that I often get asked myself. So what is it? Since metaphysics subsists in the domain of philosophy, I think it's important to first of all define philosophy. Clark defines it thusly, quote, "Philosophy is the critically reflective, systematically articulated attempt to illumine our human experience in depth and set it in a vision of the whole," unquote. Thus, it is not much an investigative inquiry into any particular matters of fact, any particular empirical matters of fact, that is, but it seeks to integrate these matters of fact systematically and meaningfully according to the first principles of intelligibility, so that human experience can be fitted to a vision of a meaningful and intelligible whole, lest reality be fundamentally unknowable. Because it is knowable at its deepest level, we can apply first principles of intelligibility to matters of fact, and this process of integration is what we term philosophy, fitting the data of human experience into a coherent vision of an intelligible whole. Now, metaphysics is going to lie at the innermost heart of this enterprise, because metaphysics is going to study what exactly those first principles of intelligibility are, and what is meant by this vision of the whole, and therefore will provide us with a proper grounding for philosophy and therefore science to even take off. Since reality is intelligible, understandable that is, we had better understand what is common to all of reality, first precisely as a community of real beings, insofar as they are real, so that we can have a firm grasp of this vision of the whole, which must come before coming to know any of its constitutive parts. We cannot begin to understand the parts of something without knowing the whole of which they are components. We only know things as components because we presuppose a whole of which they are components. So if we're going to understand the parts that make up a reality, in its individual real beings, then we had better investigate what it means to be a real being, since this status of being real is by definition common to all beings, and thus has to be a proper subject of study precisely because all subsequent subjects of study presuppose this innermost pattern of being real in the first place. So, what is metaphysics? As Aristotle said, it is the study of being qua being, or being as being. It is specifically analyzing that which is common to all of reality, namely being, and in so doing uncovering the universal properties, constitutive principles, and governing patterns that encompass all of reality under the purview of its shared participation in being as such. As human beings, this has to begin in the sensible world, since we derive knowledge from sense data. Thus, metaphysics as a human enterprise will begin by analyzing being as such, through the prism of a multiplicity of finite, changeable, and limited beings, which pretty much characterizes the sensible world, the world of sense data, from which we can derive the universal principles that join them all together as real, which is a true commonality that all real beings share. This unity of shared being amid a multiplicity of finite, changeable, and limited realm of beings is the central problem of metaphysics. And those universal principles just referred to that we will be unpacking throughout the series more or less stem from an attempt to reconcile these two apparently conflicting sides of the same coin. That is, to reconcile the problem of the one and the many. How can beings be many and yet one insofar as they all share the property of being real? How can there be change in the midst of permanence? Is there permanence at all? What is existence, and what does it mean for something to exist and to go out of existence? Is there some ultimate source of existence? Do these questions even correspond to intelligible answers, and how do we know these questions aren't just conceptual constructs that are just helpful in processing our surroundings? You can see that these questions all come together in our quest to integrate this vast plurality and diversity of human experience into a vision of a coherent whole, which is the hallmark of any quest for true knowledge if we are truly committed to the idea that reality is truly intelligible and can be known and can be probed into by the mind. If this is true, since truth is ultimately one, derived from the principle of non-contradiction, then our experience of changeable, limited, finite, and diverse phenomena should be able to be integrated into a coherent vision of the whole of reality as being, which is the foremost subject of metaphysics, which will then lead us to discerning whether there is some ultimate source to all of reality, to all of being, or if finite beings themselves are self-sufficient in the order of intelligibility to account for their own existence, which is where metaphysics will end and natural theology will begin. But we can't get to theology unless we solve, first, these inquiries surrounding being, the one and the many, change, existence, etc. You'll notice that when it comes to these notions, they aren't going to be solved by any particular empirical discovery, because empirical phenomenon takes all of these principles for granted and presupposes them. The job of the metaphysician, therefore, is to uncover and to put under logical and philosophical analysis those principles which are presupposed in order to make sense of empirical phenomena, and without which would render empirical phenomenon unintelligible and absurd, since to take away a cause is ultimately to take away the effect. So, now that we have a decent understanding of what metaphysics as a field of study is, we can then go on to how are we to understand its formal subject of study, namely being as such, which will then lead to uncover those universal principles and governing patterns which flow from being as understood through the prism of finite, changeable, and limited modes of being, which is our starting point of inquiry as human beings, who begin our knowledge in the senses, which is described in just that way: finite, changeable, diverse, plural, and limited. So I hope you get a lot out of this series. In my last slide here, I'm going to show you an outline of basically the table of contents of the book, The One and the Many, and that'll kind of be our guide as to how we're going to tackle these subjects and in what order we're going to tackle them. So like, subscribe, comment any questions or concerns or needs of clarification that you might have as the series progresses. God bless.